Hey there, Kenneth here, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to present a lecture that I'm going to do on a upcoming psychosynthesis conference in Italy. The core title of the lecture is What is the experience of the personal self and higher self? This is quite a difficult topic to go into because, as you probably know, we are basing it on psychosynthesis understanding. And the self, according to Assagioli's views, is a point of pure consciousness and will. And there's not two self when we speak about psychosynthesis. The self is one, but we differentiate between the higher self, which is the transcendent part of us as a divine being, and the personal self, which is the descended part of the self. This is the difference between Atman and the Jiva Atman for you who know something about Vedanta. I will base my lecture on Assagioli's writings, so we are so close to his understanding, but I will, of course, also add my own understanding of what the self is. There's actually three main points that I would like to present here today. What is the definition of the self? What is the experience of the self? And how can we achieve it? Let me present a first quote by Assagioli that highlights somewhat of the mystery about the conscious I or personal self. In this slide, we can see on your right the egg diagram of Roberto Assagioli. In the very center of the egg diagram, we have the conscious I, also known as the personal self, the point of pure observation and will, a dynamic observer, if you like. This is, as you can see, it's connected via a vertical line. It's an emanation, a stream of consciousness that descends from the higher self. And the higher self is at the top of the egg diagram. This is us as a transcendent being. I will go into more details when we progress in this lecture. Let me now read the first quote that in some way highlight the mystery here. How many intelligent psychologists have no idea of their self? They speak of personality, of ego as a bundle of elements, but the point in the middle escapes them. It's amazing. The nucleus of reality of our being is not consciously recognized, not even on a personal level, let alone on a transpersonal level. So why is this so difficult to understand? If we haven't had an experience of our personal self as pure consciousness, and neither the higher self, then it's actually quite difficult or perhaps even impossible to understand what it really is. It is like trying to convey the quality of blue to a blind person who has never seen it. The only thing I can do at this moment is try to give some description, some pointing out as how it is to have these kind of experiences. And then perhaps I can hope that it will motivate you, if you have not had these experiences, to take up the practice and doing the introspection so you can find out for yourself. But now let us go to the broader aspect of what is the self. Before I go into the details, I would like to give you an overview of some of the basic assumptions of Roberto Assagioli when he speaks about the self. And in this slide, we can see how some of these basic understanding plays out. We find the following assumptions by Assagioli. There is a discernment between the self as pure consciousness force and the content of awareness. And the content of our awareness is all our psychospiritual processes. And this distinction between the self and the not self, between the observer and the observed, is really center in Assagioli's philosophy and in psychosynthesis. It is throughout all his writings this difference between consciousness itself and all what arises in consciousness. And he clearly have this understanding from the Sankhya system and the yoga system in two of the schools of Indian philosophy. And it's the difference between the Purusha and the Prakriti. So this is really crucial that this runs through all his presentation of the self and how to find it. The next thing that is very important to understand is that the self is the permanent observer and the content of awareness is the impermanent object. So again, here he is basing his understanding of the self on Eastern teachings of the Atman, the Purusha, as this personal background of consciousness. So the this is the essential part of us that is undying, that is immortal, and that is eternal, and it lives in a transcendent state of being. So that's another basic understanding. So from this, we can understand that the self is something that is made out of consciousness and power. It is, in also Aurobindo's words, a consciousness force. And what is then the conscious I or the personal self? Yes, from this understanding, we can see that the conscious I is the revelation and direct experience that I'm not my body, emotions, or mind, but a consciousness force, a dynamic observer. And this is clearly a direct experience. This is a fact within our consciousness. If we do the introspection, if we do the disidentification and self-identification exercise, we can reach this level of understanding that we see that our essential identity is consciousness itself. So, and this disidentification and self-identification exercise is something that he takes from the Raja Yoga system. It's something that is related to the fifth limb of Raja Yoga Pratyahara, which means abstraction, which means, you disidentify from all the sense organs and turn your attention inwards and find this place where consciousness abides in its own nature. This is very central to Raja Yoga. The documentation for this is clearly in Assagioli's writings. As I have already said, all the above assumptions have their roots in Samkhya philosophy, Raja Yoga, and Vedanta, according to Assagioli. And there are two articles that brings the documentation for this perspective. It's one of the articles is called "The Study of Self," and another article I have written, "Why You Are Not Your Body," according to Roberto Assagioli. And I will link both of these articles, and one of them has also been made into an audio, and so you can listen and judge for yourself. Okay, let us now go to our first investigation. What is the self? Let's really go in and see if we can find some core definitions of it. So we will take now once again Assagioli's quote as a jumping board to elaborate on these understanding. So the first thing we have to do when we define the self is, as I've already mentioned, discriminate between the self and the not self. And let me read a quote here by Assagioli that really highlights this. And it's all about that the self is always the observer, never the observed. The self is always the subject, never the object. In continually striving to observe ourselves objectively, we obtain not only the desired knowledge, but also another result that is no less important and beneficial for spiritual development. This is the attainment of discrimination between the self and the not self, the I and the not I, between the spirit and the various psychological elements, between the eternal observer and the field of manifestation, to use the terms of Sankhya philosophy. It is the difference between the eternal and the transitory, between the fixed and the mutable. And the quote goes on where he fleshes it out in much more detail. So look up the quote for yourself. So you can see here, psychosynthesis is based on Eastern understanding of the self. And very often we hear that, Assagioli based his psychosynthesis on a combination or a synthesis of Eastern and Western um, understanding of the human being. And here we can see in a very direct way what kind of Eastern philosophy he was drawing on. Let's take the next quote. Here comes a very, very important quote from his first book, Psychosynthesis, in the introduction. It is a quote that is not very discussed because it's actually a bit difficult to really understand what he really points to here. But it's a quote that I find very, very fundamental. So it's about the contentless and independent self. And you could also say it is the experience of the self is independent of any content and circumstance. And let me read the quote. In my opinion, the direct experience of the self, of pure self-awareness, independent of any content of the field of consciousness and of any situation in which the individual may find himself, is a true phenomenological experience, an inner reality which can be empirically verified and deliberately produced through appropriate techniques. You can see here, and let's try to go into detail with this quote and see if we can understand what he's actually implying here. The first thing he is implying is that it is a science. You can actually empirically verify if this is true or not through techniques. And the technique he is pointing to is, of course, his disidentification and self-identification exercise based on Raja Yoga and also based on the neti-neti approach of Advaita Vedanta, where we say not this, not that, to any content so we can wake up to our true nature as consciousness itself. But what is most important here is the thing that I highlighted in yellow. So the experience of the self, of pure self-awareness, is independent of any content of the field of consciousness and of any situation in which one might find himself in. So very often when we observe ourselves, we are very much influenced by the content of our awareness. If we sit down and meditate and we feel depressed, then most of our awareness will be colored by this depression. If we sit down and another day and observe our inner psychological environment and we are very joyful, then this will color our experience. But what Assagioli is pointing to here is that the experience of the self has its own quality. There is something in there that is totally different from any feeling state, any mental state, any bodily sensation, any stressful situation. And you could actually think about the self as the eye in the hurricane. There's a silent, serene, and detached place within our being. This serene place, this detached, silent, observing, essential beingness is who we are. Let me share two more quotes so this understanding becomes a bit clearer. Here's another quote from Assagioli that points to the permanency of the self. A clear and full experience of the self gives at first such a strong sense of self identity that is felt as something sure, permanent, unchangeable, and indestructible. It is realized as such an essential reality that all other experiences and so called realities appear, when compared to it, as changing, impermanent, and of less value and significance. Such a realization is accompanied by a sense of inner independent, self reliant security, which is deeply satisfying and gives rise to a feeling of peace, serenity, and quiet joy. So when we discover our I, our conscious I, and on a later stage, our, our higher self, we discover it as something unchanging, something that is permanent, something that is eternal, something that is not changing, and something that gives rise to a place of deep serenity. And this is actually a quality that can be present even while you are in a deep psychological distress. And let me give you an example of this. In 2021, I I suddenly woke up one morning and experienced heavily tinnitus, a high ringing in my ears that came just out of the blue, and it was so stressful and was so uh, yeah, it impacted me so much that I one point thought that I was going to get crazy because I couldn't stand the sound. Then I had a meditation one morning, and in my despair and my distress, I start chanting the word of Jesus. And my subconscious has a very deep appreciation of Jesus, and even though my present persona don't think much about it. So I sat there and I was saying internally, just Jesus, and praying for help. And I did that for about 20 minutes or so. And then suddenly I start sensing that something was changing above my head. And I sense what I what I interpreted as some kind of a white light, and I also had the impression that angels were coming. And then suddenly, without any flashes, it just became totally silent within me. It was just all the tinnitus was just in the background, very low, and I was just in this center of deep silent present observation. And I knew at that point that I was this silent, observing self. I was totally secure. The tinnitus could not do anything to harm me, and it was a big turnaround because from that point on, I was no longer afraid of it. I knew that my essential nature could not be harmed by this experience. It was not a transcendent experience because I've had transcending experiences many times before. Something I already spoken about in a different video, which you can find in the description. But it was just this silence and this totally security and knowing that I am the self, this self, this is my true nature. And I think the experience lasted about perhaps 10 minutes or so. And then the tinnitus was coming back. But again, I found a center, I found a core where I could feel safe. This is an experience of the self that is present no matter what experience that you are faced with. So I hope this gives you some kind of a understanding what he's speaking about here. Let's give another quote from Assagioli. Another characteristic belonging to the realization of the self is power. It's a sense of concentrated power at rest, yet ready to express itself dynamically, either in the mastery over all elements and forces of the personality or reuse in creative activity. So this is what I would call the silent will, and this power you get in contact with when you realize yourself as a conscious I, and the void at the center is stabilized, as I've just given an example of, even though mine was not stabilized, because after a while, then all the content come back. But I had some kind of a height experience of it, and the whole purpose of disidentification and self-identification is to start making this uh, permanent self much more present in your awareness. And this takes a lot of time and work, a practice throughout your whole life. Let's go to the next. The point here is that the flickering light of the eye must become a stable flame, make the permanency of the self a stable factor in our life, because it takes a lot of training. In this slide, we can see that the flickering light of the eye must become a stable flame. In order to strengthen and make stable the pure self awareness of the observer, it is necessary to have periods of inner silence, gradually longer, to make what is called the void in the field of consciousness. So the conscious I is not something that just pop out of the blue. It's something that we really have to develop. It's something we have to stabilize. So the permanency of the observer, of the I, has to be brought to the foreground of our consciousness. It has to dominate the content of our awareness. And this is really a huge and difficult work to do. Let us now look at how we can develop our I consciousness, how we can develop the permanency of the observer. It is my understanding that there are 4 stages of I consciousness. From the start, we can say that most people don't have any understanding or any experience of their personal self, the conscious I. So there's no conscious observer. And we can say when we are at that state, we just float with the stream of consciousness. Whatever appears, whatever impulses we get, we just do what seems most appropriate according to our basic needs. We live according to the roles that life gives us. We become parents, and we have friends, and we have a job that we try to fulfill. We could also say that our life is governed by our major roles in life, and we could also call it the ego. And when we have formed an ego, when we become mature individuals, then we has created something like a boat, and this boat we can navigate on the stream of consciousness. We don't just follow every whim and every desire that comes up in our consciousness, but we try to be responsible human beings. But still, we don't have any internal conscious observer where we really reflect on our thinking. We can say that this state is characterized like we live in a city that is always clouded. In this city, we never see the sun because there's always clouds. But then sometimes, one of the inhabitants of this city, they climb up and reach above the skies and see the sun, and they come down and say that the light that is here actually comes from a source above. But all the other inhabitants, they just deny. They think that he must be mad because there's just light. And so it is when we haven't yet found the inner observer, the light of our being, then we just take the light for granted. We don't understand that there actually is a source of light within. But When we start introspecting, when we start observing what's going on inside us, we finally, at some point, understand that we can start observing what's going on inside of us. We can start observing that there are inner voices, that we are influenced by inner psychological states, and now somewhat some kind of an observer start appearing within the center of our being. We can say that the light is still diffused, it's not concentrated, but it's a beginning. But we have to understand that this observing faculty is not stabilized in any ways. It's still very, very a foggy observer. However, if we take up a practice of disidentification and self-identification, start identifying with consciousness itself, then the observers start to become much more clear. We start understanding what's going on, and we can differentiate between consciousness itself and the content of consciousness. And this is where we also suddenly find out that the silence that emerges out of this practice is actually who we are. And I had that, you could call it awakening at some time in my life. I was starting wondering why there was always, or very often, a silence within my head. Nothing happened, and I was very puzzled by it. But at some point, I really realized that this was actually me. I was the silent inner observing agent. And this was a big revelation for me. It was not a transcending or transcendent experience. It was just an immediately a recognition that I was this silent observing agent within the midst of my psychological environment. And from there, the continual striving to stabilize the void of consciousness will bring us to this place where at some point this silent observing background will become more and more present, more and more permanent within us. And this is where we have finally realized the full potential of our conscious I. It will be a center in us that is detached, free from content. It will be a loving observer and a dynamic awareness. I think the viewers will understand that this is an ideal, something that I have not reached. I have had glimpses of this as I just presented with my experience with the beginning of my tinnitus. Let us now turn our attention to the higher self. As I've already explained, the personal self, the conscious I, is an emanation of the higher self. So it's a reflection in the mental function of consciousness and will. I think a very good understanding is when, as Aurobindo, the Indian mystic in Pondicherry, speaks about the different types of Purusha, the mental Purusha, the vital Purusha, being the emotional Purusha, and the physical Purusha. And it is, the Purusha is and the pure consciousness, the transcendent pure consciousness and will is reflecting itself at different levels. And what we call the personal self is a reflection of the transcendent self in the mental function. It's a rather complicated idea that I cannot go into further detail with here. But let's go to the higher self and try to define what is the higher self. And as already said, it's ineffable. You cannot really describe what the higher self is, but we do it anyway, as you can say, pointing out some valid points that will motivate people to have the experiences themselves. So in the next slide, let's see what Assagioli has to say about the higher self. The self is not only the focal point around which the many superconscious processes occur, it is also the cause of those processes. and the source of the energy that makes them possible. So the self is the unchanging, enduring reality, a stable center of life on its own level, which has functions but is not a function. The key thought in the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, having pervaded with one part of myself the whole universe, I remain. What remains is the self on its own level, yet while it remains there, it can pervade and is pervading the whole universe of the personality, and this it does through the superconscious. We have here again this idea about a self on its own level. You could say that the higher self is in some way unborn. It is in a transcendent, eternal world beyond the body mind complex. And from this place, it emanates or it manifests its beingness within the personality. And this is a panentheistic understanding. God is bigger than the universe. It only creates the universe with a fragment of itself and pervades it with its life and its consciousness. So God is both transcendent and immanent. And the same can be said, as we can see here, from an individual point of view. The soul or Atman or the Purusha pervades the personality, creates the personality with a fragment of itself. And this is the understanding. So there is a direct experiential reality behind this. It is the difference between the Jiva Atman and the overshadowing Atman. And this is something we can wake up to when the first step is that we find ourselves as the personal observer, and then we gradually expand our consciousness and reach these higher levels that lies beyond the body-mind complex. So let us now see how the experience of the higher self is experienced. And I will take Roberto Assagioli as an example and show you how he had this experience. So let us now see how we can define the experience of the higher self. And once again, I will use a quote from Assagioli to highlight that point. In a conversation with Master Crampton, he says the following: in genuine expansion of consciousness, there's no complete loss of self-awareness of the spiritual self as center. It can be compared to a sphere which can expand indefinitely, but the center of the sphere remains. There is the paradoxical impression of not losing oneself, but being more oneself while losing the empirical limitations of the ego. It is a synthesis of individuality and universality. The individual feels identified with the universe, but there remains some awareness that he is identified with the universe. So this is a very paradoxical saying. We never lose the individuality of being me, not as separated me, but being, it's a feeling of I amness. It is, the central identity of being me, not identified with any content, now limitless. Now I'm merged into a transcendent background. I become universal. But still there is a core left in us that we don't suddenly experience ourselves to be a new person. We still have this core inner sense of being me, but now no longer restricted by any boundaries, totally free. And often there is an ecstatic bliss connected with the freedom of expanding, of being this transcendent cosmic witness of it all, but still having a center of pure self-awareness. And in some way, we can compare it to what has been called, Satchitananda in Vedanta, which is the blissful self-awareness of existence. So there is a blend of individuality and universality, but it's non-dual. There's no duality here. It's complete union. And yeah, it's very, very difficult to say anything that can really convey the meaning because it's so full of awe and mystery and yeah, you can say it's ineffable. And Assagioli actually had this experience. So let's see how he writes about it. It was an experience that came during his prison time. He was imprisoned by the fascists during the Second World War and had a month in jail where he really went deep into his yogic practice. A sense of boundlessness, of no separation with all that is, emerging with the self of the whole. First, an outgoing movement, but not towards any particular object or individual being, an overflowing of effusion in all directions as the rays of an ever expanding sphere, a sense of universal love. Then the ability to focalize the radiation towards some object or individual, and at the same time to specialize its quality. But all these qualifications remained always within the whole as parts of the identification with the whole of reality, of life, as sections of the universal infinite sphere. A wonderful merging, no separation, only differing aspects of the same wonder. And as you can see here, if you recall the egg diagram, you can see the star of the higher self is partly within the higher unconscious and outside the higher unconscious. And the part of the self that is outside the higher unconscious, the egg diagram, and headed toward the universal is identified with the whole. And we have that understanding also in Vedanta, where Atman and Brahman is considered to be the same. And this is exactly the same point of view we find in psychosynthesis, at least in Roberto Assagioli's understanding of psychosynthesis. This is how I would lay it out. Of course, this is a very limited presentation. There is so much more to be said, and in future videos, I will say much more about this. If you want to have some further take on what the higher self is and how it is experienced, then I will warmly invite you to visit my video on Transcendence, which you will find in the description below. Let me now go to my final point, because in psychosynthesis, there has been a debate about the higher self and why Assagioli placed it at the top of the egg diagram. So why is the self not equally present in the egg diagram? I've noted 6 arguments for why the higher self in its beingness is not equally present in the egg diagram. The first argument is that it's not the experience of the contemplative. All the major wisdom traditions agree that the higher self is transcendent beyond the body-mind complex. We must ascend through the great chain of being, the inner worlds of existence. And even in Buddhism, they speak of, reaching nirvana or realizing your Buddha nature. This is not something you find in the body-mind complex. You have to rise above it. You have to transcend it. You have to liberate yourself from all these ego states in order to really realize that part of your nature. And you also in Vedanta find the Atman as something that is not born, it's unqualified, it's a transcendent background from where all existent emerge. And the same with Plotinus and his undescended self. So all the major contemplative schools, they have this understanding that we have to ascend through all these different inner worlds and finally we reach the higher regions of the superconscious where we can unite with the higher self. To say that the self is equally present within the whole of the egg diagram, it also contradicts the understanding of the self as a higher synthesizing center. The atom, the solar system, and all humans have a core and a center. And Assagioli placed the higher self on the border of the superconscious and the universal as this paradoxical unity of individuality and universality. So the higher self is, in Assagioli's version of psychosynthesis, considered to be an organizing, a synthesizing, transcendent agent for development. It has one part of its focus within the personality where it tries to inspire and uplift its representative, the personal self or the Jiva Atman, and try to motivate that self to liberate itself from ego consciousness. So, if the self was equally present, then where is the center? Where is the organizing center of this higher self? That's another question. Another problem with this notion of the self as equally present all over the egg diagram is that it veils the distinction between the self and the superconscious content. You know, the superconscious content is processes, is becoming, is inspiration, it's energies that are in flux, in process. But the self is a stable point of pure consciousness and self. And if the self is all over, how can we then distinguish between ourself as a cosmic witness and all the processes of the universe? Again, here we are back to the fundamental notion where we discriminate between the self and the not self, between Purusha and Prakriti. It also, and I find this to be a very solid argument, it contradicts the difference in luminosity between the higher and the lower levels. When we experience the higher superconscious worlds, then we get uplifted. We experience ecstatic joy, inspiration. We become enlarged, and it's very, very joyful and expanded. And this is so because the superconscious at its higher level is very close in proximity to the higher self. So, in some way, it shares some of its states. So, if the self, the higher self, was equally present, why is it so that when we experience the lower unconscious, our hate, our jealousy, our attachment, our fears, that we get so dark, we become so contracted? It should not be so if the self is so present, the higher self is so present. Then there should not be that difference in luminosity. That's, I found, a very compelling argument that the higher self is located in the higher regions of the superconscious. I also think that placing the higher self all over the egg diagram blurs the distinction between ego processes and soul processes, soul being the higher self, because the soul or the higher self, it instigates all the processes of becoming in the superconscious. But at the same time, we as a personality, we as a conscious I, we express ourselves in our daily life, and we are in many ways responsible for all the processes, all the ego processes of our needs and our cravings and our reactions to circumstances. So when we look at the egg diagram, we can say that the lower unconscious and the middle of conscious is processes that is initiated by the personal self. And it's all about our survival, our ambitions, our thriving in our personal world, while the higher self is active in the superconscious. And these two processes collide at some time in our life when we start to ascend, when we start to aspire to live a more spiritual life. Then we have the battle between the ego processes and the superconscious processes. And it really makes sense that there is a duality that we have to bridge through our inner transformation and our inner striving to unite with the higher self and embodying the energies of the higher self in our personal life. And finally, my last point in this regard is that it makes suffering much harder to explain. It is hard to explain suffering, but if the self is so near in the lower unconscious and in all the processes we have with our attachment, why is there so much suffering? Why are we not more inspired by the wisdom of the higher self, the love of the higher self? Why are we not just bathing in the bliss of unconditional love all the time? If the higher self is so present and so near to us, why do we suffer? Why don't we hear the higher self advice and impulses if the higher self is so present? I think this is very difficult to explain if you have this notion that the higher self is equally present all over. Okay, this was my final statement today about the personal self and the higher self. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture and that you will consider subscribing to the channel and share the content if you find it valuable. I know there is much more to say about the topic, and I will surely investigate it further in the future. But for now, I would like to conclude with this presentation today. So I wish you all the best, and thank you for following me here on YouTube. Bye-bye.